Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to the Meiji Guillotine Murders by Fūtarō Yamada, translated by Bryan Karetnyk. Chapter 7. The name Hepburn was known to Kazuki. 10 years ago, this American physician and missionary had come to Yokohama to preach the Jesus faith and to help the sick and the poor. "Have you been here before?" asked Kazuki. "Yes, I have. Last year, towards the end of the 11th month, there was an incident in which a foreign teacher by the name of Long was attacked by some thugs. He sustained a serious cut to his shoulder and was later carried here on a makeshift stretcher. I was the one ordered to supervise his transportation. Just then, a man dressed in white appeared in the front door and was about to begin sorting through the patients in the queue, when suddenly he looked in their direction. "Hello," he called out, making his way towards them. "It's Chief Inspector Kawaji, isn't it?" Beneath his white coat he appeared to be wearing clothes from another world. He was a tall, bearded man in his late 30s, and although he was wearing what looked like a white headscarf, you could see that his hair was cropped in the Western style. Yet there was no doubt about it. This man was Japanese. Kawaji recognized him as Ginko Kishida, Dr. Hepburn's assistant. Kishida shook Kawaji's hand in the Western style, and as he asked how he could be of assistance, he looked up and down at Kazuki's odd garb. Having introduced the two men, Kawaji began to explain. "We saw a man entering the building just a moment ago. His name is Magobe Akamatsu, and he was once the Lord of Karatsu's chief minister in Edo. We'd like to have a word with him, if possible." "Ah, Akamatsu-san! Of course! It's the 5th today, isn't it?" "I believe he comes here on the 5th of every month." "What are these visits for?" "That's correct. He began, but stopped himself. "I'm not sure it's my place to tell you. At any rate, please do come in, if you'll follow me." He set off towards the entrance. The two chief inspectors passed through the entrance and were shown into a large reception room immediately on the left. On the wall hung a picture of the Virgin and the Child, and the shelves were adorned with a statuette of Christ, a globe, and other curiosities. "Kishida's involved of all manner of business in Yokohama," Kawaji explained. "He started a newspaper, founded a shipping company, and even ran an oil company. But since meeting the venerable Dr. Hepburn, he's been utterly devoted to him. Not only is he helping the good doctor to compile Japan's first Japanese-English dictionary, but he also assists him in performing surgery." "And you said he was called Ginko? That's a funny-sounding name, no?" "Ah, yes. I believe his real name is Ginjiro. But one way or another, he seems to have adopted the less than flattering nickname. He's a decent sort." Presently, they were joined by Kishida and Akamatsu. Kishida was holding what appeared to be a bundle of documents in his hands. Are you the gentleman from the Imperial Prosecuting Office? Asked Akamatsu, foregoing the usual pleasantries. And you're interested in the reason for my coming here each month? The fact of the matter is, said Kazuki with equal candor, that your name has come up in our efforts to establish the whereabouts of the intendant of Iki province, Lord Ogasawara. Akamatsu shot a grave and pensive look at him. I see. Well, since you ask, it would appear I can conceal it no longer. As Kishida-san here can confirm, I come here in order to receive letters and remittances from his lordship in America. Remittances, you say? And what exactly is Lord Ogasawara doing over there? His lordship has become an advisor to a whaling company somewhere on the west coast of America. I believe the town is called San Francisco. He sends his correspondence by ship every month. I have no way of receiving letters from America at home, and moreover, since his lordship is, as you know, in exile, I have had to exercise caution. So I asked the good doctor if he would receive these letters for me. That, gentlemen, is why I come here once a month. I assume that you had come in connection with this, said Kishida, setting down the bundle of letters on the table. Unfortunately, no post arrived today. But here are the letters that Dr. Hepburn has previously received from Lord Ogasawara. Kawaji picked up a few of the letters automatically, but the envelopes were inscribed with only English characters, and he was unable to make out any of it. Kazuki also picked up an envelope and peered inside it. I'm afraid they're all in English. Kishida laughed. His lordship must have had somebody else write them. As he looked at the figure dressed in the suikan, his smile almost seemed to mock him. You said something about remittances, said Kazuki as he extracted the letter. Remitted to whom exactly? That's, right, Akamatsu hesitated. To you? Absolutely not. Nor should I have any reason to receive something like that from his lordship. It is in fact for somebody else. And would that somebody else happen to be his mistress, Oyumi? You're very well informed, said Akamatsu in astonishment. You are correct. Dr. Hepburn then exchanges it for Japanese money and has it delivered to Miss Oyumi. Just then, Kawaji interrupted him. Is it possible that the person who delivers it is a woman? Ah, I wonder, said Kishida, nodding, before briskly striding out of the room. A little taken aback by this, Kazuki regained his composure only after watching him go. Incidentally, he said, are you aware that this mistress of Ogasawara's, this Oyumi, who resides in the Yanaka district of Tokyo, is with child at present? Kazuki had cut straight to the chase. Akamatsu's face visibly stiffened. What's more, no matter how you look at it, all the evidence points to the conception having occurred after Ogasawara's escape. What do you make of this? Akamatsu heaved a deep sigh. So, you know about that as well, he said. Then, staring off into space, he added, believe it or not, it was the doing of Ogasawara's Ikkiryo. His what? His Ikkiryo? Just then the door opened, and Kishida peered in. Behind him stood a young woman dressed in white, just like him. Kishida said, this is Oden. She helps us at the hospital, but she's also the one who's been delivering the money. Her hair was tied up in the style traditionally worn by married women, and she had on a kimono. But she also wore a choker about her neck, which lent her a beautiful, exotic air. Kawaji had only heard the tale from the owner of the household goods shop in Yanaka, but now, seeing this woman, he was left in no doubt that this had to be she. "Thank you," he said with a nod. The nurse then vanished as suddenly as she had appeared. In the summer of the previous year, she had come knocking on the door of Dr. Hepburn's house together with her leper husband. Now her husband was undergoing treatment, and alongside nursing him, this virtuous wife lent a youthful and efficient hand in the hospital. Around 10 years later, Chief Superintendent Kawaji would have the temptress Oden beheaded. But back then, only the devil himself knew this. "About that money," said Kazuki. "Why didn't you deliver it to Yanaka yourself?" "It's as the saying goes. Despise a monk and you will despise his robes," replied Akamatsu. "Just as there are many who have despised Lord Ogasawara, so too are there those who do not care much for Miss Oyumi. That's why I've tried to keep her whereabouts as secret as possible. Still, it isn't beyond the realms of possibility that some powerful men in the capital have got wind of it. But as I am a known supporter of Nagamichi Ogasawara's, there could be no question of my delivering the money. I knew that it would be better for our safety if the courier had nothing to do with us. If Oyumi and I were seen together, tongues would wag, and that would be dangerous. So I decided that under no circumstances would I meet Oyumi in person. I'm ashamed to have had to go to such lengths, but that's why I had to trouble Dr. Hepburn to have the money delivered." "I see. So do you mean to say that men are prohibited from visiting her?" "Not at all. Only that I myself don't go there." Kazuki returned to the strange words that he had heard earlier. "You were saying something about Ogasawara's Ikiryu." "Yes, I was skeptical about it myself, but not so long ago there was a letter from his lordship to Miss Oyumi, in which he apparently said that he would return to Japan from America as an Ikiryu, so that he might enfold her in his arms once more. Since then, his lordship has appeared at the house in Yanaka several times, and Miss Oyumi claims that the pregnancy is a result of this." "Of all the absurd things!" cried Kazuki, sneering. "I don't suppose the letter also said that the Ikiryo travels by telegraph, did it? Anyway, if you were having nothing to do with Oyumi, then how could you possibly know all this?" "Well, it's just that after she fell pregnant, Miss Oyumi wrote to me once or twice, you see. As I said, I didn't believe it at first, and I worried that if she truly was pregnant, and if the other clansmen in Tokyo came to find out about it, there'd be no telling what kind of trouble it would cause. Forgive my asking, but couldn't Oyumi simply have taken a lover, as some are saying?" "And just what do you mean by that?" asked Akamatsu, his eyes flashing. "The only reason I haven't drawn my sword on you is that I know that this investigation is being conducted by the Imperial Prosecuting Office. Why, what you're saying is preposterous. Only those who don't know how much his lordship loved his Oyumi know how much Miss Oyumi pined for his lordship could think such a thing." It must have annoyed Kazuki to hear his words dismissed like this, when only a moment ago the man had spoken of living ghosts. So, you're saying that the black and white shadows spotted in the Yanaka graveyard are Ogasawara's Ikkiryo? Muttered Kawaji, as forbiddingly pragmatic as ever. You'd think a country like America could at least send a man's Ikkiryo by telegraph, said Ginko, roaring with laughter under his impressive beard. Immediately, however, he resumed a more solemn demeanor. The Virgin Mary conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit. In fact, our own Dr. Hepburn converses with the Holy Spirit daily. Even in this modern age, miracles of faith are possible, he added, crossing himself. Dr. Hepburn was seemingly too busy administering treatments, so in the end the chief inspectors were unable to see him. What was apparent, however, was that the letters and the money sent by Ogasawara were handled by the saintly doctor himself, proving that Ogasawara had to be in America. I'd call that a perfect alibi, wouldn't you? Said Kazuki, a faint, cryptic smile crossing his lips. It was a curious choice of words, for they seemed to suggest that Ogasawara was across the Pacific Ocean congratulating himself on getting away with something. Yet that was exactly how Kawaji felt about it too. Chapter 8. It should be noted at this point that Kazuki and Kawaji were not the only representatives of the Imperial Prosecuting Office to have dealings with Dr. Hepburn. These other men had, moreover, an altogether different purpose in contacting him. One that was only to be expected of the Jesus faith loathing Imperial Prosecuting Office. In a letter from Hepburn dated 2 March 1871, March 2, 1871, he writes, "There is nothing we can expect from the Japanese government. It seems to be directly opposed to Christianity, with the intention of driving it out of Japan entirely. You may be aware of the Christian pamphlet I translated and published a few years ago. The government is trying to ascertain the identity of the Japanese who helped me with its publication. To do this, the Imperial Prosecuting Office has dispatched an agent to investigate both me and the individual involved. For several days after their suspicions were dispelled and the mystery only deepened, Kazuki seemed troubled. For all his show of solemnity, he told Kawaji, that Akamatsu is corrupt. He's fiddling the scrip exchange." "Oh? What makes you say that?" "It's all very complicated. I've spoken to Kaoru Inoue over at the Treasury, but the long and short of it is this. He says that even if an official in charge of scrip is up to no good, it's nigh impossible to find proof of it these days, so he's advised amateurs like us not to get involved. If you ask me, there's something fishy about that Inoue, too, but I can't exactly do anything on a hunch alone. My instinct tells me Akamatsu's definitely up to something, though." And yet, my investigation turned up that his house in Takebizaka is small, that he has no family, and that he lives frugally. with only an old maid. On the other hand, that opponent of Nagamichi Ogasawara's, Sagen Tagusari, is a real drinker and womanizer. He leads a life of luxury, spending all his time in Yanegibashi and the other pleasure quarters. He may well have had a fortune back in Karatsu, but it just doesn't add up for a low-paid functionary in the Ministry of Popular Affairs. But what does all this have to do with the woman in Yanaka? I'm not sure, but these are the facts, said Kawaji. I've been thinking about it since the other day as well. I just can't bring myself to believe what he said about the Ikkiryo. You don't think the child's father could be Akamatsu, do you? It's possible, but if that were so, he could have taken the money to her directly. And if he were trying not to invite suspicion, then why would he go to such lengths as to involve Dr. Hepburn as an intermediary? It's truly baffling. And besides, it's too far-fetched that a man who once served as a daimyo's chief minister in Edo would try to attribute a woman's pregnancy to an Ikkiryo. In that case, isn't it time we asked the woman herself? Ikkiryo or not, the law has no cause to punish whoever fathered that child, so long as it wasn't Ogasawara having sneaked back into Japan. That's true enough, said Kazuki. Still, just to be on the safe side, I'm having Tagusari watched by Sergeant Saruki, Akomatsu by Sergeant Imokawa, and Sergeant Ichinohata's keeping an eye on that Koibuchi couple. Who knows whether anything will come of it? They're not a very trustworthy lot, but they'll have to do for now. A few days later, on the 13th day of the second lunar month, Sergeants Onimaru and Yoko Makura rolled up at the headquarters of the Imperial Prosecuting Office, where Kawaji and Kazuki had just arrived. "We saw it! We saw it!" they both cried out. "What did you see?" asked Kawaji. "Ogasawara's Ikkiryo." "What on earth are you on about?" Even the ordinarily composed Kawaji raised an eyebrow at this. "Where?" "In the graveyard at Yanaka." Lost for words, Kawaji fixed the two razotsu in his gaze. "Oh, Yuta was still there, were you?" "Still there? But you ordered us to keep an eye on it!" they both cried, bowled over by Kawaji's forgetfulness. Both faces looked drawn with hunger, and the color had vanished from their cheeks. And little wonder, for nearly half a month now, right in the middle of winter, they had been staking out the graveyard in Yanaka. It was not that Kawaji had forgotten about them entirely. Every now and then they would suddenly pop up in his mind. But he knew that Oyumi had been receiving visitors, and what was more, after hearing the strange tale from the Koibuchi woman, he had expected word from them any day now, and let half a month slip by in the process. "Oh, I do apologize. What were you saying about an Ikkiryo, though?" Ikkiryo is a disembodied spirit or living ghost from Japanese folklore that leaves the body of a living person to haunt others or places, sometimes while the person is still alive. Ikkiryo. "Oh, I do apologize. What were you saying about an Ikkiryo, though?" he asked, surprised that these two had even heard of such a thing. "Actually, sir, before we do that," said Yoko Makura, "there's something else you should know." "That's right," added Onimaru. If we don't tell you, you might never believe it." The pair were mumbling, their jaws trembling. "I'm sorry to say so, sir, but you see, for the last 3 days there have been others helping us with the surveillance," said Yokomakura. "Others? Who?" "Well, 3 nights ago there was a man by the name of Sagen Tagusari and another called Heikurō Koibuchi." "What?" "Tagusari apparently used to be the chief minister for the Karatsu domain, but now he's working in the Ministry of Popular Affairs. He said he wanted to catch the guy who got Miss Oyumi pregnant and asked whether we'd let him join us. He said you told him, sir, that we were staking out the area." Hearing this reminded Kawaji that he had indeed told Tagusari about the surveillance. Then Tagusari got in touch with this Koibuchi guy, who came along too. "Ah, that's right. Apparently his wife was more interested in the investigation. But since a woman with children can't very well stake out a graveyard at night, she sent him instead. He didn't seem too happy about it, truth be told." Having mentioned the Razotsu surveillance in order to rein in their wayward behavior had, it seemed, backfired. "Then," Yokomakura continued, "the night before last, a guy called Magobe Akamatsu came along. He greeted Tagusari as though he hadn't seen him in a long time. He'd apparently even been the domain's man in Edo at one point. He said he'd heard from a lady that 2 Razotsu were keeping watch at the graveyard, so he'd come to see how it was going. I think he had some suspicions about us, though." Yokomakura scratched his head. "Of course, sir, you told us to make sure we weren't spotted, but that was impossible. You can't just sit out there being buffeted by the wind on a winter's night without some sake to drink and a fire to keep you warm. Never mind that night. Even during the day, we had to keep moving about to keep warm. Otherwise, we'd have caught our death." "Why didn't you report these other men at once?" "Tagasuri told us not to. He was ever so menacing, and, well, it was only a couple of days. Besides, we thought some company would help distract us from the cold and the boredom." "Oh, very well. Proceed with your story." "Well, sir, Akamatsu told us about Ogasawara's Ikiryo. Apparently he heard it from his lordship's mistress. Naturally, we all told him there's no such thing. Akamatsu said he was skeptical himself, but that if an Ikiryo really was visiting the place, he wanted to see it for himself. But he couldn't have the lady knowing about this, so he joined us, crouching behind the gravestones. Truly, it was an unexpected gathering of those factions for and against Lord Ogasawara. And it appeared at last this morning. Yes, in the early hours, around the tolling of the 6th hour. We were all there. We had a fire going and we were talking about all the changes since the restoration. And enough about your idle chatter. What exactly did you see?" "Oh, well, all of a sudden in the distance I thought I could hear a strange, faint sound. It was going, Ki-i-kuru! Ki-i-kuru! We all jumped up to take a look, and there, coming from the vicinity of the house, we saw a shadow floating in mid-air. Well, not mid-air exactly, but it seemed to be gliding over the gravestones. It was just as dawn was beginning to break, and the world seemed to be shrouded in a thin layer of ice. Perhaps it was all the talk of ghosts and spirits, but Onimaru's narrative had taken an uncharacteristically literary turn. He looked like a warrior. He had on a helmet and a jinbauri. Even Kawaji thought he could feel a drop of perspiration trickling down his back. We were all terrified, but we began to creep towards it, with Akamatsu leading the way. He went ahead and stood right in its path, Yokomakura piped up. He was riding in a rickshaw. The sound we'd heard was the noise of the wheels, only there was no runner pulling it. What do you mean? Shouted Kazuki. Even though there was no runner, the shafts of the rickshaw were parallel to the ground. And just like that, it came our way, bearing the warrior along. He was wearing a black lacquered hachigane, a helmet with an enormous two-pronged crest, each prong more than 2 feet long, and a pitch-black jinbauri. Akamatsu cried out, But, isn't that his lordship? I saw him too, sir, interjected Onimaru. Or rather, I didn't see him. You see, there was no face looking out from under the helmet. What there was, I couldn't say. It was as though the air itself had donned the helmet. With a voice like a strangled chicken, Tagusari challenged the ghost before drawing his sword and rushing towards it. And as he did, the faceless warrior spoke. His voice was terrifying beyond words, sir, said Yokomakura. You dare to draw your sword against your lord, Sagen Tagusari? He said. I have shown myself for the benefit of those who do not believe. Let it be known that anybody who dares to hinder the nightly visits of Lord Agasawara's Heikurō will be possessed and slaughtered. His words knocked us clean off our feet, sir. Then the rickshaw set off again, making its way between the graves. Or rather, no, it went off as though the graves weren't even there, just making that same sound. Ki-i-kuru! Ki-i-kuru! Both Kawaji and Kazuki just stared at the two Razotsu, unsure what to make of this. This must be some kind of a joke, said Kawaji at last, but his words were perfunctory and meaningless. Perfunctory, adjective, lacking in interest or enthusiasm. Perfunctory. Synonyms include apathetic, casual, uninterested, uncurious, unconcerned. Perfunctorily. Perfunctory. But his words were perfunctory and meaningless. A joke? Said Onimaru. If you think this is a joke, sir, then have those 3 other men brought here and ask them yourself. Yokomakura began to stroke his long beard. There's one thing I don't understand, though, he said. According to what Hakamatsu told Tagusari, it was Ogasawara's Heikurō that fathered the woman's child. But what if the Heikurō doesn't have a body? Then how did it manage to get her pregnant? Speechless, Chief Inspector Kawaji paused and, only after quite some time, let out a protracted roar. Damn it! Protracted. To prolong in time or space. Continue. Protracted. To extend forward or outward. Protracted. Archaic. Delay or defer. Protracted. Synonyms include prolong, stretch, drag out, elongate, protracted. Chapter 9. It was not until a week later that the actual murder took place. Moreover, it was not by chance that Kazuki and Kawaji found each other at the scene of the crime immediately after the curious incident occurred. Here is how it happened. It was the 20th day of the second lunar month, and the rain had been falling since morning. In those days, of course, the lunar calendar lagged somewhat behind the western one, so this would have been some time in late March. Although it was still bitterly cold, the rain already carried the distinctive scent of spring. As usual, Tokyo had become a city of mud. But later in the afternoon, the temperature plummeted, and the showers of rain turned into flurries of spring snow. That evening, after their offices had closed for the day, Sagen Tagusari and Magobe Akamatsu met at Yanagibashi to have a few drinks in the company of some geisha. Later, at around 9 o'clock, they hailed the rickshaws and headed for Akamatsu's house. By then, Tagusari, who liked a drink and was already a little worse for wear, was in the mood to have some sport with his companion. There, in Takebezaka, they had the old maid prepare some snacks and recommenced their drinking. They asked that the rickshaws wait outside the house, and since it was snowing, invited the two pullers into the kitchen and plied them with sake. Meanwhile, two Razotsu were following these events closely. In fact, for some while, Saruki had been keeping watch over Tagusari, Imokawa over Akamatsu, and Ichinohata over the Koibuchi couple. But in spite of this, the three Razotsu were unaware that these three men had gathered at the graveyard in Yanaka the night on which the aforementioned Ikkiryo had made its appearance. Unable to bear keeping watch in such bitterly cold weather, all three had decided to skip work. It later transpired that Akamatsu had spotted Imokawa, invited him round, won him over, and given him money to go out drinking. The whole thing was a shambles. Perhaps they knew Kazuki had only asked them to keep an eye on the men as a precaution, and perhaps that was what led to their negligence. But now that night, the 20th of the month, acting under strict instructions, Imokawa and Saruki followed the two officials from Yanigabashi to Hongo. Imokawa and Saruki followed the two officials from Yanigibashi to Hongo, winding up in Takebezaka. They were already aware that Akamatsu and Tagusari, despite having held positions of influence within the Karatsu domain, were on opposing sides of the Ogasawara debacle and did not enjoy an especially close relationship, to say the least. Yet, after their evening drinking in Yanagibashi, one of them had invited the other to his house. Something like this had to be reported to the chief inspector. In fact, the two men knew that if they didn't, they would be hauled over the coals for it. As they discussed their observations, they saw the rickshaw pullers enter the house and begin drinking, And so, surmising that the situation was unlikely to change for some while, Imokawa raced off to the Saga mansion to tell Kazuki, while Saruki rushed to find Kawaji in Kyobashi. It was the strangest thing. By chance, the two Razotsu were both given the same order to flag down two rickshaws, and together the four all made their way back to Hongo. The snow was letting up, but there was already a good 2 inches of it on the ground. At this time of night, in this kind of weather, the streets were practically empty, and the few rickshaws carrying people with some business to attend to stood out. There was no moon, but the nocturnal city was bathed in an uncanny light reflected from the snow. It was a little after 11 o'clock when, not far from Takebezaka, Kazuki alighted, leaving Imokawa and the rickshaw behind. There were no footprints or rickshaw tracks on the road running along the canal. "Kawaji isn't here yet," Kazuki muttered to himself as he looked around by the light of the snow. Just then, he spotted 2 rickshaws crossing the Suido Bridge, one after another. It was Kawaji and Saruki. Joining together, the 4 of them then turned left off the main road and began to climb Takebezaka. It was a narrow, gently inclining slope with snow-laden branches of bamboo drooping over the walls on both sides. As he climbed the hill, Kawaji was struck by a most peculiar sensation. But at the time he had no idea what the cause of it was. Akamatsu's house stood about 50 yards up. "The rickshaws are gone," Imokawa whispered to Saruki. "Tagusari must have gone home," he replied. The light was still on in Akamatsu's house, however, and voices could be heard shouting. Just then, the lattice door at the front opened, and 5 yards from where Kazuki stood, frozen to the spot, 3 figures came clattering out. "Hey, where are the rickshaws?" a familiar voice shouted, having realized their absence too. "Has Tagusari left already?" The voice belonged to a somewhat drunken Akamatsu. "Left? But who would he have to pull him?" "Hey, mine's gone as well," shouted one of the rickshaw pullers. Where could they both have gone? They followed the rickshaw tracks with their eyes and looked startled when they first noticed the group standing in the shadow of the wall. "So, we meet again, Chief Inspector Kazuki of the Imperial Prosecuting Office. We were just doing our rounds. How have you been keeping?" Patently untrue though this was, Akamatsu asked without thinking. "Have you just arrived?" "This very minute." With no time to doubt them further, and seeming to have forgotten the conversation at Dr. Hepburn's residence the other day, Akamatsu said, "That's very good of you. Only, I was entertaining a guest here at my house, and he seems to have vanished all of a sudden. We were just looking for him." "I'm sure he wouldn't have been so impolite as to leave without saying goodbye," said Kazuki, cocking his head and looking at the snow. "But the rickshaws are gone, and you can see their tracks leading off," Akamatsu suddenly shouted, raising his hand as Kazuki and the others tried to draw nearer. "Please don't move." He turned and called into the house, "Bring the lanterns, old woman!" Then, turning back to them with a somewhat more sober look on his face, he began to explain. "Well, gentlemen, I'm not sure exactly how much the Imperial Prosecuting Office knows already, but judging from what you said the other day, I'd imagine it might be a fair bit. You see, Tagusari was the leader of the group that made his lordship anathema within the Karatsu clan. Well, you see, Tagusari was the leader of the group that made his lordship anathema within the Karatsu clan. Anathema. Someone or something intensely disliked or loathed, usually used as a predicate nominative. One that is cursed by ecclesiastical authority. Ecclesiastical authority. A ban or curse solemnly pronounced by ecclesiastical authority accompanied by excommunication. Anathema. Ecclesiastical. Of or relating to a church, especially as an established institution. Ecclesiastical. Ecclesiastical. You see, Tagusari was the leader of the group that made his lordship anathema within the Karatsu clan. Well, he and I do not see eye to eye, and ever since the restoration, even though we both work for the new government, we haven't exactly been on the friendliest of terms. So, the other day, when he and I happened to bump into one another for the first time in a long while, there was much to discuss. And I ended up having a drink with him this evening in Yanagibashi. There had been misunderstandings on both sides. There were some points we were able to clear up and others that we weren't. So I invited him here, where we could talk to our hearts. Just a moment! Don't move! He said, raising his arm again. Now, be that as it may, just a short while ago, while I was reciting some poetry to him, Tagusari lay down, using his arm as a pillow, and began to drift off. Suddenly, however, he must have felt an urge and got up to go and relieve himself. When he didn't come back, I went to find him, but he was nowhere to be seen. He seemed pretty inebriated, so I wanted to see whether he was sleeping it off somewhere, but try as I might, I just couldn't find him. It was then that I called these rickshaw pullers, who had been drinking in the next room, and when we came out here to check, we found the 2 rickshaws missing. The old woman brought the lanterns. It's odd enough that the pullers are here while the rickshaws themselves have disappeared, but I've just noticed something even more bizarre, he said, bringing the lantern in his hand lower so that it lit up the ground. Would you look at that? The rickshaw tracks are there, but there are no footprints from the person pulling it. Sure enough, there were signs that the rickshaws had been turned around in the snow, and there were even some footprints too, but when the chief inspectors followed the tracks in the direction in which they had moved off, there were wheel tracks with no footprints between them. It was still snowing when we got back, so these must have been made more recently. Let's follow these tracks, Akamatsu said, setting off, lantern in hand. Wearing a look of bewilderment, the 2 rickshaw pullers followed behind him. As they made their way down the gently sloping hill, Kazuki and the others set off after them. They could see all the way down the hill the footsteps they had left as they came up, but they couldn't really tell whether there were any footsteps from before that. He's right, you know, Kawaji groaned. That must have been what gave me that odd feeling earlier on. The wheel tracks without any footprints. The wheel tracks overlapped an awful lot, but if you looked carefully enough, you could tell that there was more than one set. They went down the 50 or so yards of Takebezaka. now overlapping, now parting, before cutting across the main road and vanishing over the embankment of the river. It was only after half an hour of frantic searching in the dark that there, below the embankment of the Kanda River, 2 rickshaws were found half submerged, and it was a good hour after that, and after having sent for more lanterns and several ropes, that the 2 rickshaws were hauled out of the river along with the drowned corpse of Sagen Tagusari. There was nothing I could have done to prevent this, Akamatsu sighed, though it does rather unavoidably cast suspicion on me. As he looked down at the terrible, sopping wet corpse lying on the snow-covered embankment, he shuddered. Not only were our relations as I described previously, he continued, but after he came to my house, he had the temerity to disparage his lordship and contradict me. Temerity, unreasonable or foolhardy, contempt of danger or opposition, rashness, recklessness, temerity, a rash or reckless act. Temerity. He had the temerity to disparage his lordship and contradict me. I'm sure these rickshaw pullers must have heard us arguing. Of course, they were drinking in the kitchen, but you've seen how small my house is, and the walls are made of mere paper. Their teeth chattering in the cold, the 2 rickshaw pullers nodded. Still, my recitation seemed to lull him to sleep. Say, did you 2 happen to hear me reciting the verses? We did. It was after that all this commotion began. But surely you don't think that I bundled Tagusari into a rickshaw, pulled him all the way down the hill and pushed him over the edge before making my way back up? And what about the second rickshaw? Said Kazuki, casting a quizzical look at Akamatsu. That's just it, he replied. I don't know what it means either. But there's no way that one man could pull 2 rickshaws. He'd have to go up and down the hill twice over, and if I'd done that, there's no way that these gentlemen wouldn't have noticed. Yes, that's quite right, the rickshaw men agreed. We could hear him reciting the poetry the whole time. Despite this agreement, however, they exchanged bewildered looks with one another. What puzzles me is that there are no footprints, Kawaji grumbled again. No matter how you look at it, a rickshaw needs somebody to pull it. You don't have any ideas, do you, Kazuki? I'm afraid not, he replied. I can't fathom why there were 2 rickshaws. Was one empty, or was it carrying someone other than Tagusari-san? It must have been his lordship! Akamatsu suddenly exclaimed, his serene features trembling. Lord Ogasawara must have been riding in the other rickshaw. Yes, that night in Yanaka, his lordship appeared riding in a rickshaw with nobody pulling it. His Ikiryo must have lured away the disloyal Tagusari and meted out the ultimate punishment. As Akamatsu lifted his icy eyes up to the dark sky above, Kawaji thought he could see drifting down the snow-lit slope the ghostly apparition of 2 driverless rickshaws, one carrying Tagusari, the other carrying a warrior in the pitch-black jinbaori and the jet-black helmet with a long crest. Chapter 10. The following night, a strange ceremony took place on Takebezaka. 2 empty rickshaws were positioned in front of Magobe Akamatsu's house, and opposite them 3 braziers were lit. The body of Sagen Tagusari, having been conveyed to the Imperial Prosecuting Office already, was brought back and laid there. Except for his face, His whole body was covered in green bamboo leaves. A series of stools had been set up along one side of the hill, and on these sat the assorted grandees of the Imperial Prosecuting Office in all their finery, their faces grave and austere. Austere, an adjective, stern and cold in appearance of manner. Austere, morally strict. Austere. Their faces grave and austere. They were joined by old Manabe and his daughter, as well as Kawaji. The gradient was so exceedingly gentle that it was not at all uncomfortable sitting there. But the snow had of course melted and was now replaced by mud. On the opposite side, 5 Razotsu sat cross-legged on a straw mat, holding their instruments in their laps. Beside Kazuki in his suikan stood Akamatsu, dumbfounded by the spectacle before him, and most of all by the sight of a golden-haired, blue-eyed Miko bathed in the light of the fires. Since the Imperial Prosecuting Office was at a loss to explain the curious events of the previous night, the Miko had been called in to summon the spirit of the deceased and solve the mystery. The large Kaendaiko rang out, struck by Sergeant Onimaru. Dong, dong. The other 4 then joined in, calling forth the strange, eerie strains of the Kagura music. Plong, 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 boing. Aviriya, asobi hasu tomo, mo sanu, asakura ni, amatsu kami, kunitsu kami, orimashimase. Holding the Kagura bells in one hand, the Miko began to sing and dance. Kling, kling. Awariya, asobi hatsu tomo, mo sanu, asakurani, narui zuchimo, orimashimase. Her beautiful yet extremely slow chanting carried on. Awariya, asobi hasu tomo, musanu, asakurani, sagen tagusari, no mitama, mairitamae. As her chanting swelled to its climax, the Kagura bells rang out. Cling, cling. Ima, Mairu. I am the spirit of Sagen Tagusari. In that instant, the uncanny voice of Tagusari's spirit raised goosebumps on Akamatsu's back. For the first time since arriving in the land of the dead, I can see the land of the living without hindrance. I now know that Lord Ogasawara never did go to America. At Hakodate, he boarded the American ship, but when it called in at Yokohama, he stole ashore and hid himself in Tokyo. What? Came a cry from the audience. However, this was not Akamatsu, but Kawaji. As he hid in Tokyo, Lord Ogasawara ventured out to visit Oyumi in Yanaka regularly. They did not live together, lest he be discovered and Oyumi implicated in the crime. And yet, he could not stop seeing her. This was very typical of his lordship. "This is an outrageous thing to say!" exclaimed Akamatsu. Once or twice, Lord Ogasawara was spotted at the graveyard in Yanaka. Each time he escaped by putting on a Polonia helmet and a jinbauri that he always carried to disguise himself. This, too, was typical of his lordship. Of course, Akamatsu knew all this. In fact, he even embezzled his superiors' money in order to help his lordship. What's more, Akamatsu had no direct contact with Lord Ogasawara at all, and just delivered the money straight to Oyumi, who, in case she should ever be questioned, went to the trouble of asking a certain American in Yokohama to make it look as though his lordship was sending the money from the United States. As they had feared, the Imperial Prosecuting Office eventually came to question this American. They were shown Lord Ogasawara's letters from America. One of the officers was fooled, but the other, who knew a little English, saw through it immediately. Hearing this, Kawaji winced. But there was one person who had known all this all along, and that was I, Sagen Tagusari. In that instant, to the astonishment of all, the mouth of Tagusari's corpse even appeared to move. To catch Lord Ogasawara and turn him over to the authorities, I thought I would first have to flush him out. So I kept a close watch on Akamatsu's movements and saw that he was up to something strange. Akamatsu realized this and offered me money to keep quiet. "My only dishonor was in giving you money. Your greed knew no bounds!" cried Akamatsu, as though forgetting himself. He looked around in alarm, but nobody said a word. To my shame, I said nothing. I, the leader of the Nakakuni faction in the capital, was no better than the Nagamichi faction's Akamatsu. We thought that nobody else knew, but the source of our failure lay elsewhere. Oyumi fell pregnant, and this was spotted by a certain meddlesome woman. Akamatsu had been worried about this for some time. If it were to become known, if the Nagakuni faction were to discover that Ogasawara himself was the father of the child, he would find himself in danger. But if the Nagamichi faction were to believe that the child was the result of adultery, then Oyumi would be in danger. The very notion that it could have been his lordship's Ikkiryo was patently absurd. But it was our only way of our desperate situation. But it was our only way out of our desperate situation. As he watched Akamatsu's face turn ashen, Kawaji could feel the blood rush from his own cheeks, which had been burning only a moment ago. When our attention turned to that meddlesome woman, I panicked. If she caused a fuss and the members of the Nagakuni faction took notice, there would be trouble. Meanwhile, the Imperial Prosecuting Office had ordered some Razotsu to keep watch on the graveyard in Yanaka. If the truth were exposed, both Akamatsu and I could be sure that we would suffer the consequences. So, Unless the meddlesome woman and Imperial Prosecuting Office saw his lordship's Heikurō, we would find ourselves boxed into a corner. After hastily discussing it with Akamatsu, we realized there was no need to physically show them. Buying off the Razotsu and that meddlesome woman's husband would have the same effect. So we decided to give them a lot of money and have them tell tall tales about a ghostly warrior. Kawaji turned and glared at Onimaru and Yokomakura, his eyes as incandescent as the flames in the braziers. Perhaps they were deaf to the lament of the deceased that was coming from the Miko's mouth, but Onimaru, who besides his drum had the gong as well, and Yokomakura, who had his flute, just kept striking and blowing on their instruments like madmen. Boom, boom, boom. The foolish Razotsu were easy enough to pay off, but we weren't so sure about the woman's husband. In the end, however, he too agreed. Though he was once a proud samurai from Mito, he had fallen on hard times long ago and wanted to get one over on his hen-pecking wife. Heikurō Koibuchi was not present at this scene, but in later years his wife would leave him and go on to greater things. Tell them what happened next, said Akamatsu through gritted teeth, half in defiance and half in resignation. Soon, however, I began to worry. I wondered how long a deception like this could hold up. Then I received word from Akamatsu. He was even more worried than I was. We met in Yanagibashi to talk things over. Now I realized that his biggest concern was me. He thought that I might betray him at any moment and he had to deal with me while he still could. Akamatsu got me drunk and brought me back to his house in Takebezaka, where he plied me with even more alcohol. Between that and waking up in the land of the dead, I recall nothing. But I fear he must have laced my drink with sleeping pills procured somewhere in Yokohama. While plying me with this sake, he stepped out for a moment and stared to position the 2 rickshaws. In a flash, Kazuki shot up and set about standing the 2 rickshaws facing one another. He stacked the shafts on top of each other. Kazuki did as the Miko said, and then bound the 4 poles together with a length of thin twine. They were tied so that they would hold the shafts firmly but snap under the right pressure. Kawaji's eyes were bulging. Before him was no longer a rickshaw, but a rather bizarre-looking 4-wheeled chariot. Later, as the recital continued, I fell asleep. He carried me outside, sat me in one of the rickshaws and tied me to it, using the same thin twine. By now, everybody was sitting there frozen, their eyes wide with astonishment, for, following the Miko's words, Kazuki had picked up Tagusare's body and was placing it in the rickshaw. It was all over in the blink of an eye. Akamatsu gave the rickshaw a push and off it went all by itself. The Kagura bells rang out, cling cling, and sure enough, all by themselves, the 2 rickshaws set off slowly down the gently sloping hill. Akamatsu then returned to the tatami room and began to make a commotion. The 2 drivers who had been drinking in the next room, oblivious to all this, then joined him. The two rickshaws appeared to move as one, gradually gaining speed as they progressed down the slope, until at last they vanished over the edge of the embankment. From where they were sitting, not even a splash could be heard. The grandees of the Imperial Prosecuting Office were speechless. As it had been snowing that day, Akamatsu believed he could have the drivers testify to the mysterious absence of footprints left in the snow. But even if it hadn't snowed, he reasoned that it would have been the same with the mud. Immediately after that, two members of the Imperial Prosecuting Office turned up, lending credence to his story. But even had it just been the two rickshaw pullers, he was sure that things would go smoothly. Now I realized that it was Akamatsu who concocted the story about the warrior being carried to the graveyard by the driverless rickshaw. So he must have already been thinking of ways in which to murder me even then. The Miko's voice was becoming fainter and fainter. Because the two rickshaws fell over the embankment one after the other, the twine holding them together snapped, as did the twine holding me in place. That is how I came to find myself in the land of the dead. The Miko's golden-haired head slumped forward. Suddenly, Kawaji jumped to his feet. "Tell us where Lord Ogasawara is hiding!" he shouted. "His lordship is en route to America," came the faint, otherworldly reply. With that, the Miko fell silent, as though having lapsed into deep slumber. A picture of composure, Sergeant Onimaru struck the Kaien Daiko twice, boom boom, in quick succession, bringing the ceremony to an end. As he did so, Akamatsu collapsed onto the muddy ground. "I'll deal with him," said Kazuki. "You lot go and fetch the body and the rickshaws out of the water again." He then turned to Kawaji. "The show seems to be over." Fixing Onimaru and Yoko Makura in his baleful gaze, Kawaji was about to go running after them, but Kazuki barred his way. "Wait," he said. "They're like cleaning rags. You can't use them without sullying your own hands, though they do have their uses. I'd appreciate it if you'd go easy on them in this case, if only for my sake." Kazuki smiled sweetly as the five Razotsu went racing down the hill. Across the way, Esmeralda, dressed in her Miko's attire, approached old Manabe and his daughter. Standing there in her long, specially made scarlet hakama, she curtsied to them. "Bonjour, I'm very pleased to see you again, Mademoiselle Ennui." A brief digression on Nagamichi Ogasawara. It was not until the middle of the 5th year of Meiji, 1872, that the Class A war criminal Nagamichi Ogasawara, who had been hiding all along in the Hongo's Tsumakoi-zaka, reappeared, having kept a close eye on the release of Takeaki Enomoto. At the time, however, he sent a report of his homecoming to the new government, claiming that in the 2nd year of Meiji, while voyaging from Hakodate to Tokyo, his ship had run adrift because of the winds and waves, and that only now was he able to return to Japan. At any rate, just as he had calculated, he was not subjected to any punishment. Ogasawara lived until the 24th year of Meiji, 1891, having sired more children in his twilight years. He died peacefully and was buried in the graveyard at Yanaka.